When talking about organismal biology, scientists can approach organisms and classify organisms into two categories based on their approach to reproduction. There's lots of ways to qualify and quantify organisms, but what we'll focus on is reproduction, mainly because this is going to tie in more in the future when talking about populations and communities. Reproduction ultimately is the goal of evolution. I shouldn't even say the goal of evolution, but the goal of life. You live in order to pass on your genes to your offspring. Now, from a human standpoint, that might not be why you live, and that's okay. But again, talking about it on a biology grand scheme of things, that's kind of the goal, is to reproduce. So there's two categories. We're going to talk about each of these more in depth, but as a quick overview, one goal or one way to reproduce is to just make a ton of offspring. Lots of eggs, lots of sperm, lots of larvae, lots of offspring. But there's drawbacks to that, right? It takes a lot of energy to make all those eggs. It takes a lot of energy to produce that many larvae or that many offspring. And so typically there's drawbacks to that. They might be a lot smaller. They might be less likely to survive. On the other hand, maybe you invest more energy into your offspring, but you only have a few of them. And these are referred to as the K-strategists. Those that make many offspring but don't have a lot of survivors, those are referred to as R-strategists. And here's two examples. So here on the left-hand side, we have clams. Clams just release the reproductive material and lots of it into the environment. Whales, they only produce, depending on the species, about one calf at a time. So two very different reproductive strategies. And it's not that one's better than the other. They each have their benefits and they each have their drawbacks. And obviously both can be successful because we still see organisms that are part of each group. It's not like the K-strategists outcompeted the R-strategists or vice versa. So I do also want to make a note that this is a continuum. There might be some organisms that are very, very much R-strategists and some that are very, very much K-strategists. But there's also some that are in between. Scientists try to group organisms into these nice categories, but nature doesn't care about that. Right? Evolution doesn't care about that. So we'll talk about the stereotypical R and K strategists, but we'll also talk about some that might be a little in between. So let's start with our R-strategist. I have both an animal and a plant example. So here on the animal side, we are seeing rabbits, like a day or 2 day old rabbits. And then on the right hand side, a dandelion. And so what these dandelions and what these rabbits have in common with one another is one, they have short lifespans. Short is relative. For example, humans, our average lifespan, I think, is 70-ish years. Elephants and turtles, much longer. In relation to those, these might be only a couple years. Or thinking about some insects, maybe only a couple months. And the biggest thing for these guys is our strategists have tons of offspring. Lots and lots of them. But the trade-off of being able to produce so much offspring, which takes a lot of resources, is that typically those offspring are small. Not just literally small, but also underdeveloped. So if we look at these rabbits on the left-hand side, they can't open their eyes yet. And a lot of their organs aren't fully formed yet. The mother rabbit gave birth to them underdeveloped. But that's normal for rabbits. That's normal actually for a lot of rodents. We think about dandelions, they have literally very small seeds. You think about insects, they're like small little larvae. So lots and lots of offspring, but typically small and underdeveloped. Depending on the species, there might be no parental care. With plants, that's obviously the case. There is no parental care. But with rabbits, depending on the species, you might have parental care for a month. You might have parental care for a week. With a lot of organisms, particularly insects, most organisms of even amphibians, they just lay their eggs somewhere and then go away. Same with fish as well. They lay their eggs somewhere, swim away, never to see their offspring again. And Again, that comes at a drawback. For the parent, you're free, right? You can go and reproduce more, you can go do what you want, but that also means that the offspring aren't being cared for. They're more likely to be predated upon. They're more likely to be affected by the environment. So that parental care has a benefit to offspring survival, but it also has a downside to the survival of the adult, right? If you're putting yourself in predator's way, that's going to be an issue. So related to this small, underdeveloped offspring, related to this lack of parental care, typically R-strategists have a huge loss of offspring. So with these rabbits, there's maybe 20 rabbits in this picture, maybe only a couple survive to adulthood. With these dandelion seeds, there's probably hundreds of dandelion seeds on this dandelion, but maybe only one or two actually grow into that plant. And then finally, these kind of organisms do really well in unpredictable conditions or changing conditions because they can reproduce so quickly. That means that if their population is wiped out, they can very quickly recover. If there's one or two individuals left, they can very quickly recover because they have short lifespans, they're reproducing a lot. Sure, they have a massive loss of offspring, but when they're making offspring all the time, they're playing essentially the numbers game. Right? The more you throw at it, the better. If there's a forest fire, you get rid of all of these trees, all of these shrubs, and the first thing that comes back are grasses and R-strategists. The first thing that comes back are insects, R-strategists. It might be a long time before deer come back. It might be a long time before large other mammals come back. It'll be a long time before fully grown trees come back. Because these R-strategists they can pump out kids a lot faster. And if they don't have any competition, then they might not have as huge of a loss of offspring in comparison to if it's an established environment. So R-strategists are really good at surviving just kind of the changing conditions in the world. So, good for them. But a lot of the animals that you think of more than likely relate to our other type of strategists. One last thing, it doesn't apply to us right now, but the R in R-strategist actually stands for something. You won't really know what it is until we start talking about population growth. And in the population growth video, I will make this connection back to R-strategists, but just kind of put this in your notes, like R stands for something, and go back and fill in those notes. If I introduce it now, it just won't make sense. So the flip side, we have K-strategists. So the two examples I have here are elephants, and then thinking about the plant point of view, I have palm trees. So these organisms typically reproduce later in life. They don't reach sexual maturity until much later. For some large animals, this could be 20, 30 years. It's actually same with trees as well. A lot of trees, it takes a long time before they can go to seed. If they have, or really when they have offspring, they typically have a small number. So if you think about a lot of our mammals, they're only having one, maybe two offspring at a time. You think about, palm trees, you're like, oh, there's got a lot of coconuts or seeds on it, but that's not a lot compared to that dandelion, compared to an acorn tree, compared to a maple tree that has all those little helicopters. This is actually a very small number of fruits and thereby seeds that are found on this plant. These organisms, one of the reasons they're reproducing later in life is they just have a longer lifespan, and it just takes a little bit longer for all of their reproductive structures to mature. If you have a shorter lifespan, that typically means you have a very early sexual maturity age and can start reproducing very quickly. These organisms, kind of excluding plants, but these organisms have a lot of parental care. You don't see this elephant just leaving his offspring for the wild. And this should make sense to you. If you're going to invest a lot of time and a lot of energy into developing only one or two offspring, you want to make sure that offspring survives, right? You don't want that to be for naught. So you're going to watch out for predators. You're going to make sure they're getting enough food. You're going to make sure that they're getting enough water because you want to make this a successful offspring. But if you're laying 1,000 eggs, you probably don't care. More than likely, some of them will survive. But you have a lot more parental care with our K-strategists because it's really the only way to ensure that their offspring survive. I will say, if we want to tie this into plants, plants that have a lot of fruit or a very protective fruit is almost like parental care. Right? Remember that fruit can provide nutrients for that developing seed. Coconuts especially, the coconut fruit itself, lots of fats and lots of protein in it, which is really great for a growing plant. That dandelion, it just has, the fruit is the part that makes it fly elsewhere. And finally, these organisms do best in a stable environment. Let's take elephants, for example. Elephants have the longest gestation period. Gestation is how long they're pregnant for. They're pregnant for 22 months, so nearly 2 years, if only 2 elephants are left in an area. And let's say they're young elephants, let's say they're 5 years old. It might be another 10, 15 years before they can even reproduce. And when they do reproduce, their offspring might be another 20 years before they can reproduce. And they only created maybe 1 offspring. Which means if their environment is changing a lot, if there's a lot of wildfires, if there's a lot of drought, if there's not enough food, their populations can't react quickly. And this is actually a huge issue with climate change because the environment changing so quickly is favoring some organisms, unfortunately the ones we don't want to be favored, such as insects, whereas our larger organisms, they literally can't evolve and change fast enough to keep pace with a changing environment. So these are organisms you see in a stable environment or an environment that's not changing that much, that's been pretty constant. This is not to say they don't coexist with R-strategists, but this is just kind of where you would find these organisms, mainly because they can't really sustain their populations in rapidly changing environments. Now, similar to R-strategists, this K does refer to something. It is related to population growth. We'll talk more about that in that lecture video, but just make a note that the K does stand for something and it does relate to something. And then finally, I have some follow-up questions for you, or really just something to think about. So, sea turtles, humans, oak trees. I'm actually going to talk about sea turtles a little bit, just to kind of focus on that idea that R and K strategists is a continuum. So I don't know how much you know about sea turtles, but one, they live to be a pretty old age. That's kind of a K strategist thing. They also reach sexual maturity a little bit later, also a K-strategist thing. But they lay their nest on a beach somewhere. They lay lots of eggs, 30, 40 eggs. That's kind of an R-strategist thing. And then they abandon them, right? The female will bury the eggs in the sand and then go into the water, never to see her offspring again. So no parental investment, a very R-strategist thing. And so here's an example of an organism that displays both K-strategist characteristics and R-strategist characteristics. And who knows what we'd argue? I mean, they can't reproduce quickly just because it takes so long for them to hit sexual maturity. But they can have a lot of offspring, and if we care for those offspring, we can grow their numbers really quickly if humans were to step in and stop predation and whatnot. So sea turtles are a great example of one that doesn't really fit into either category. You could look on 5 different websites and they would tell you 5 different things, and that is totally okay. On a test or a quiz or assessment, what I'd like you to be able to do is identify which characteristics make it more like R, which characteristics make it more like K. So as we end this video, again, just go ahead and think about humans. Think about oak trees. Oak trees are the ones that are producing acorns. What characteristics do each of these have that might lend themselves to more an R strategist or a K strategist?